right, this is exciting because this is our very first Ask a Property Manager segment here on the Rent Prep Facebook group. So, Andrew Schultz is with us here today. Andrew is a very qualified, experienced property manager here in the Buffalo, New York area. 120 doors roughly, right?
Give or take, yeah.
Okay. And we're both in the Facebook group, and we've been on the podcast together and kind of talking about things. And there is some amazing advice in the Facebook group, but there's also some advice sometimes that isn't the best advice. So what I thought might be a good thing to do is to have on a property manager every so often here on the Facebook page, and then we can kind of help clarify and go through some questions that you have experience with. So, Andrew, if you're ready, I got 3 questions for you. And here's the first one. This comes from Joanna. And she's asking if you have any advice on a tenant going month to month after their lease expires. So basically, what is your advice and what do you do with managing your 120 doors after the first year, whatever the lease is, expires? What do you do when you renew the lease?
Well, there's a few factors at play here. Here in Buffalo, as you know, we have very, very cold, very, very snowy winters. And basically, once back to school season ends, right around now, leasing essentially stops until the weather warms up again. There's not a lot of people that want to move in the middle of winter unless they have a really good reason. And some of those reasons are great, such as new job moving into the area. Some of those reasons are not so great, such as getting evicted, getting thrown out of my house. We do tend to see more leasing immediately following Christmas and New Year's.
Okay.
There seems to be a bump up after Christmas and New Year's for 2 reasons. Newly engaged couples looking to move in and start a life together, and couples that decided that they couldn't handle each other over the holidays and are getting a divorce. So
Sure.
somebody's looking for an apartment.
Yeah.
But most of the winter is very, very, very quiet in Buffalo as far as leasing goes. So I would say weather should play into your plans for renewal as well. If somebody has a lease that it's ending and you're in a decent season for re-rental, push that 1-year lease option.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a situation where their lease kind of leaves them with an out in the middle of winter, when they come up for renewal, maybe offer them a 6-month lease term that puts them back on your schedule, so to say.
Mm-hmm. I was talking to you before too, and you were bringing up considering what your rental portfolio looks like too. Do you want to
Sure.
explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's every lease renewal gets treated on a case-by-case basis with some generic rules that we go by. So we always try to have our leases ending sometime between, I would say, the beginning of March and the end of October is kind of that cutoff point here in Western New York. That's kind of our prime leasing season. That's when you're going to find that you have the best pool of tenants to qualify for your apartment. So that's a big portion of it. And that's kind of a Western New York thing. Well, not necessarily just Western New York, but it's a cold weather climate thing.
Mm.
If you're in California where you have beautiful sunshine all the time, I don't know what California's rental season is like. They may have a 12-month rental season. They may not have a lot of people move during the summer because it's just too hot. It's one of those things. So it's part of it's seasonal. The other thing that I would take into account is look at your portfolio. How many vacancies do you have? Potential vacancies do you have coming up in that time frame? We have one client right now that's in the middle of refinancing 5 buildings. They're all duplexes with 1 triplex, total of 11 doors. So we've been doing anything we can to keep tenants in apartments just so that they don't leave and cause issues because the bank's coming in and doing appraisals and why are there vacancies, and making things look good on paper for the bank is what's important on that portfolio right now, more so than squeezing an extra $25 or $50 a year or a month out of the tenant over the course of a year. It's more important for that client right now to have the vacancies filled so that we can refinance and he can buy more property and continue down his plan. So
Yeah.
that's definitely a part of it too.
One of the tools I've used before, and I've assessed my own rental property, I believe it's called rentrange.com. And it's about like $15 a report, but it's pretty interesting when they were showing your seasonality of your rental market. So it'd show for that specific property, and I'll put that graphic up on the screen if I can find it, but it just kind of showed for Buffalo exactly like what months are the worst and what times are the best kind of thing. So if you're unsure in the location you're at, maybe it's worth spending that one-time investment of $15 to get like a real thorough, in-depth kind of analysis of your rental property.
Yeah, definitely. That could be incredibly useful.
So, moving on to the second question that came from Stephanie here. She was asking about prospective tenants. If they're college students and their parents will be responsible for the rent, what do you require and from whom?
I love this question. We, at one point, were managing about, I want to say it was either 25 or 30 doors by University at Buffalo South Campus, right on Main Street in the city of Buffalo. And we basically had two different types of tenants that were coming in and renting from us. One group was international exchange students, and for whatever reason, the other group seemed to be girls from Long Island. So the girls from Long Island would come in, they would fill out their application. Most of them were just going to school. They were relying on help from parents or student loans or something like that as their basis for income. Almost all of those students required a cosigner. So what we would do is we would usually have parent, guardian, grandparent, whoever was going to be their cosigner would also fill out an application, submit their proof of income the same way the regular applicants would, and we would run credit and background checks on everybody so that we knew what we were dealing with. With a cosigner, we look for more income. We usually look for an income of at least, I would say, 4 to 5 times the rent as opposed to our normal 3 times the rent.
Okay.
The reason we do that is because we look for more income from somebody who may suddenly become responsible for a tenant's default. So obviously the cosigner has their own rent or mortgage, vehicle payment, credit card bills, what have you. We want to make sure that if all of a sudden this tenant defaults, they're going to be able to pick up the slack and pay for that lost rent, if you will, that the tenant default. So we look for a little bit higher income level from our guarantors than we do from our normal average tenants when they come in to apply.
Okay.
And then with our international students, they're tough. Basically, the only thing you can do with an international student is going to be, and this is going to be state dependent. Some states have laws as to what you can charge for security deposit. We would generally try to get a 2 month security deposit as opposed to a single month. So if it's, say, an $800 a month apartment, we're looking for a $1,600 security deposit as opposed to an $800 security deposit. And just
I'm
trying to
assuming
do it.
that's just because if they decide to skip town after graduation,
Yeah,
or
exactly.
it's hard to track them down if they're in another country.
Exactly. And there's, it's not as though most of the international students that come in have assets here that we can go after. Most of them are relying on either help from home or student loans again. And once they leave the country, it's very hard to get anything back out of them. So, if you can get an extra security deposit or if you can get a couple of months prepaid rent up front just to offset that risk, that's typically what we look for in a scenario like that, just because it is a higher risk. You don't have a social, you don't have an asset that you can try to go against. So once that tenant leaves the country, it's very difficult to collect anything.
So I'm curious. You don't have to answer this, but you made it sound like it was past tense that you managed those student housing. Do you still do
Yeah.
student? Was there any particular reason you got away from that type of portfolio?
It wasn't so much the portfolio as it was just the client. He and I had different ideas as to how things should have been managed, and we just couldn't come to terms on a couple of what I figured were key issues. And ultimately, we just decided that he was better off seeking a different management solution.
Would you have so in the case of Stephanie here, it sounds like she is renting out to college students. If you
Mhm.
had one piece of advice, what would it be to somebody in that?
Frequent inspections.
Okay.
Um, there were nights that I would, especially like Friday and Saturday nights, because I have no life. I would just get in my car and drive down by all of our rentals at like 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, just to see what was going on, to make sure kids weren't having a raging house party or something like that.
I've been
And we
to a
caught
few
them
of those
doing
at UB South.
it. Yeah, absolutely. I
Alma
mean, so
mater.
you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's a rough
And
rough part of town there.
yeah, it gets pretty rough. It's
Yeah.
not as bad as it used to be because they've got a lot more increase in the number of patrols in the area.
Mm.
But it's at the end of the day, it's still an asset that still needs to be protected. So I
What
would
would
say frequent inspections
are you talking like
is,
monthly?
I would say monthly is appropriate for college students.
Okay.
A lot of times you have college students that may not even know each other going in. With our international students, they very seldom knew each other going in. So they were just kind of all thrown into a situation where they were living together suddenly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's insane the craziness that we walked into. But I would say once a month is not too frequent for college student inspections.
Okay.
If you're going to go out and collect rent from them directly, most college students prefer to pay online. Their parents definitely prefer it. But if you're going out and collecting rent manually, that's a good time to just take a walk through. You don't have to walk into the bedrooms and stuff like that. Leave them their privacy. But if you just walk through the common areas, you can tell if there's a giant pile of dishes in the sink, if the bathrooms aren't clean, if the common area has a 6-foot long bong sitting on one of the tables. You know what's going on in the house, and you've got to start letting the tenants know this ends now.
I think though it's just really tall flowers, and that's a vase.
It's a vase.
It's a vase.
I got that quite frequently whenever I
yeah, right. All right. So last question here comes from Tracy, and she said, "How do you decide when you need to increase the rent when renewing a lease? If you go from a 1 year and they're willing to sign another 1 year, do you automatically increase each year? What is a typical increase?"
A lot of questions there. It's case by case basis, just like when we do our lease renewals. If I think that we're at market rate for rent, I may not adjust it at all. If they're going to stay for 1 year and they've been a good tenant with no late pays, there's a number of factors that we look at. Has the tenant been a good tenant? Has the tenant been a trouble tenant? Has the tenant had more than one late pay over the last 12 months? Do I expect that this tenant is going to stay for the full 12-month term, or do I think that they're going to renew and then try to get out of the lease 3 months from now? So there's a lot of factors that go into, how do you bump it? When do you bump it, et cetera. Anybody on a month-to-month or a short-term lease automatically gets bumped because there's more of a risk there. So you're offsetting that risk. On our 1 year lease renewals, if I think we're at market, usually I won't even bother. If I think we're below market, I'll try to bring it up to market, just to keep up with the pace of inflation and things like that. I would say our average bump in rent is between 2.5% and 5%. Based on the market conditions and things like that. You don't want to bump it so high that they start shopping for another apartment. Mm-hmm. But if you bring your apartment to market rent, everybody's like, no, stay below market rent because then they'll stay longer. I disagree with that. Even if you bump to market rent, they're not going to move because they're still going to have all of the expense and all of the headache of moving from one unit to another, laying out another security deposit, waiting for their original security deposit to come back.
Hoping that there's no gap in like your rentals,
right,
that you can kind of butt them up next to each other. I mean, that's kind of a pain too.
Exactly. Or trying to get an overlap and stuff like that. Most people won't move unless you are going like way above what market rent would be considered for that property. So as long as you're being reasonable, most tenants understand. Plus your expenses go up every year. I can't think of the last time. I'm looking right now. The city of Buffalo just released their 2017-2018 tax rate list. Guess what? It went up again.
Yeah.
Your expenses go up every year. Handymen get more expensive, taxes get more expensive, insurance goes up every year. So to not raise the rent is really just costing you money. Mm-hmm. So you have to raise. I would say you have to at least seriously consider raising every year to keep yourself current with the market rents.
Yeah, I know my brother, he's got a rental property. It's a double in West Seneca, New York. And he had one of the rentals was severely underpriced under the market. And his lease came up with his tenant, who is a good tenant, and he's like, look, I'm going to raise the rent. I'm not sure how much it was, but I'm sure it was more than 5% because it was pretty underpriced. And the guy is just like, Andy, I can't do that. Like, it's not happening. I can't, And Andrew's like, all right, like, sorry, So right. The guy comes back to him a couple of days later, and he's like, I can't find anything nearly this nice, even close to that price still. So, okay, I'm good.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, and that happens in a lot of instances. We're dealing with a building right now up in Lockport. It's a 5-unit building that I don't think the rents have been raised ever. I mean, we're talking rents in like the $355 range for a 1-bedroom. It's crazy low. And even any other 1-bedroom in that area, right around the corner at another building, we're getting $550 for a 1-bedroom. So these rents there's a huge disparity in the rents there.
Yeah.
We bumped all of those tenants up to between $425 and $450, depending on the tenant and things like that. All of those tenants got a huge bump of about $75. Not one tenant decided to move out.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for kind of clarifying and giving some extra clarity to these answers here and these questions on the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. And hopefully we can kind of make this a weekly thing, or maybe, at least once a month. But thank you for your time. And I don't think I actually told anybody in the beginning. Andrew, who do you work for?
Sure. I'm an associate broker with Realty Edge. It's a full-service property management and real estate firm here in the Buffalo area.
All right. Yeah, Andrew's definitely a guy. If you got questions, hit him up in the Facebook group. He's got lots of great answers. He's always real solid with his advice. So yeah, thanks for being on the segment here.
Thanks for having me.